My name is Sierra, and I have just realized that my value in this family is only worth the price of a single economy class plane ticket. That morning, our Ohio apartment's kitchen felt colder than usual. Shoulder-high stacks of brown cardboard boxes filled every corner, leaving only a narrow space for the three of us to stand. Mom stood near the counter, holding a white envelope. Her face looked tired, but there was a strange glint in her eyes as she looked at my younger sister Cassidy. On the table lay only one printed airline ticket. Mom cleared her throat and gave me a look I knew all too well, the look that asked me to understand even before she explained. She said our savings were running low due to the deposit on the new apartment in Seattle. She told me we couldn't afford 2 plane tickets. Initially I thought that made sense. I was already prepared to look for a cheaper bus or train ticket, even if the trip took 3 days. I didn't mind. I was used to living frugally. However, the next sentence that came out of Mom's mouth hit me harder than any news of poverty ever could. Mom said that Cassidy had to fly because she couldn't handle long journeys and had an interview scheduled for her new art school. Meanwhile, because I was the strong one and the only person she could trust to watch over all our valuables, I had to ride with the moving truck. I stared at Mom, searching for any sign that she was joking. Traveling 2,000 miles in the cab of a cargo truck with a middle-aged stranger I had never met wasn't a travel plan. It was a punishment. Beside her, Cassidy was busy checking her freshly polished fingernails, acting as if this conversation had nothing to do with her. There was no apology, no offer to switch places. Without much argument, I eventually stood on the sidewalk as dawn broke the next morning. A large gray truck was already parked in front of the building. The driver, a middle-aged man named Hank, whose scent was a mix of tobacco and instant coffee, gave me a brief nod. He didn't say much, which actually relieved me a little. Mom hugged Cassidy tightly in front of the taxi that would take them to the airport. She kissed Cassidy's forehead repeatedly as if my sister were going off to war, even though she would just be sitting in a plush seat for 4 hours watching movies. When it was my turn, Mom simply patted my shoulder and told me to make sure the box containing her favorite ceramic collection didn't break. She didn't even notice the dark circles under my eyes from staying up all night finishing the packing that Cassidy was supposed to do. As I climbed into the high cab of the truck, the loud thud of the door closing felt like the end of my youth. The seat was covered in old, cracked vinyl that felt piercingly cold against my skin. There was no legroom. Under my feet sat a shabby backpack containing all my clothes for the next week. The truck began to move, the engine roaring so loudly it vibrated through my chest. As we crossed the city limits, my phone buzzed. A notification appeared on the screen. It was a photo posted by Cassidy. She was sitting in a luxurious airport lounge, holding a green logo coffee cup with a wide grin. The caption read, "Finally leaving this boring town. Seattle, here I come." I turned off the screen and stared out the window. The familiar buildings were slowly replaced by an endless stretch of highway. I began to count in my head. This journey would take about 48 hours if we only stopped for gas and quick meals. 48 hours during which my sister would sleep in a soft hotel bed because they would arrive first, while I tried to close my eyes with my head leaning against the vibrating glass of a truck window. A tightness began to form in my throat, but I swallowed it whole. I had been trained to be the pillar. Since Dad left 10 years ago, I was the one who helped Mom calculate the electric bills. I was the one who cooked dinner when Mom was too depressed to get out of bed. I was the one who did Cassidy's schoolwork so she wouldn't cry from the stress. Everyone in this family depended on me, yet not one of them ever asked if I was tired. Hank turned on the radio, playing an old country song with lyrics about loss and lonely roads. I leaned my head back, trying to find a comfortable position in his hard seat. Behind me, in the dark steel box, our entire lives were stored in crates. And here I was, Sierra, treated like just another piece of dead weight. The only difference was that those boxes probably received more careful treatment than I did. I closed my eyes, imagining the fresh Seattle air Mom had promised. But deep down, I knew this move wouldn't change anything. I remained the beast of burden, and Cassidy remained the princess. This 2,000-mile journey had just begun, and for the first time in my life, I started to wonder, what would happen if I stopped being strong? What would happen if I let go of all this weight and let everything shatter? The sound of the truck tires grinding against the asphalt became the background music to my dark thoughts. I didn't know what awaited me at the end of the road, but one thing was certain. The Sierra who stepped off this truck would not be the same Sierra who climbed into it this morning. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon by the time the massive truck carrying my entire life pulled into a vast parking lot on the side of the interstate. The hiss of the air brakes from Hank's truck sounded incredibly loud in the silence of the night. My body felt stiff. My back ached from sitting in the same position for over 12 hours, and my feet felt slightly swollen. Hank cut the engine, then looked at me with old, weary eyes. He told me we would stop here for a few hours to rest before continuing our trek through Nebraska. I climbed down from the truck cab with unsteady steps. The night air outside was sharp and cold, biting through the thin jacket I was wearing. Hank walked toward a small coffee shop that was still open, leaving me alone beside the giant vehicle. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the nausea caused by the constant jolting of the road. My phone vibrated in my pocket again. I opened it to see a message in the family group chat. My mother had sent a photo of their hotel room in Chicago, their layover while waiting for their connecting flight tomorrow morning. In the photo, Cassidy was jumping on a white bed that looked incredibly plush. Mom wrote a short message below the photo, asking if I had reached the first rest stop. But before I could even reply, she sent another message containing a list of items I needed to ensure didn't shift inside the truck box. There was no question about whether I had eaten or if I was cold. Her focus was always on the inanimate objects she deemed more valuable than my comfort. The bitterness I had been suppressing began to rise to the surface. Driven by a pressing curiosity, I took the spare key to the back box that Hank had given me. I wanted to make sure that, at the very least, my personal belongings were safe. I pulled the heavy iron door lever with great effort. The sound of metal grinding echoed through the deserted parking lot. As the door swung open, the scent of dust and old cardboard wafted out. I turned on my phone's flashlight, scanning the stacks of items piled to the ceiling of the truck box. At first, everything looked normal. I saw our plastic-wrapped living room sofa, the wooden dining table, and stacks of Cassidy's boxes labeled in large, red permanent marker. Cassidy's boxes were placed in the center, surrounded by protective padding to prevent scratches. However, when I pointed the light toward the hardest-to-reach back corner, I found my own boxes. My heart sank. The boxes containing my college books, my winter clothes, and a few mementos from my late father were simply tossed onto the truck floor without any padding or base. In fact, one of my boxes looked crushed under the weight of Cassidy's very heavy vanity table leg. I crawled into the darkness of the box, trying to shift a few things so my boxes wouldn't be destroyed further. That was when I saw something out of place. Tucked between the gaps of a stack of chairs was a small tote bag belonging to my mother, one she should have taken on the plane. Perhaps she had forgotten it or accidentally left it behind during the loading process yesterday. The bag wasn't zipped shut. I pulled it out, intending to keep it in the front cap so it wouldn't get lost. But as I held the bag, a clear plastic folder fell out. I picked up the folder. Inside were several moving documents and a receipt with the logo of the airline they had used. My eyes narrowed as I read the numbers printed there. It stated clearly that Mom had purchased 3 plane tickets 2 weeks ago. The departure date was the same, today. However, beneath that receipt was a refund slip for 1 ticket in my name. My hands began to shake. Mom's excuse that we couldn't afford 2 tickets was a bold-faced lie. She had actually bought a ticket for me, but she had intentionally canceled it only 3 days before departure. I searched for the reason by digging further into the folder. I found another purchase slip, the latest version of a smartwatch that cost almost exactly the same as one economy class plane ticket. The purchase date for the watch was the same as the date my ticket was cancelled. I remembered Cassidy showing off her new watch this morning before we parted ways. She said it was a farewell gift from her friends. As it turned out, it was the result of my cancelled trip. Mom chose to give a luxury gadget to Cassidy rather than let her eldest daughter sit comfortably on a plane. She chose to let me be stuck in this truck for dozens of hours just so her golden child could look more stylish in the new city. I sat down on the cold truck floor, surrounded by the shadows of silent objects. This truth felt more suffocating than the dusty air inside the box. All this time, I had believed the narrative of financial hardship Mom barked every time she asked me to sacrifice. I always felt guilty if I asked for something new because I didn't want to add to her burden. But now I realized that burden never existed for Cassidy. That burden was created specifically for me. I looked at the photo of Cassidy on my phone once more. She looked so happy. Meanwhile, I was in the middle of a highway in the middle of nowhere, smelling of sweat, having just realized that my own mother considered my comfort tradable for a smartwatch. The trust I had guarded so strongly began to crack, piece by piece. Hank returned from the coffee shop and knocked on the side of the truck, calling for me to get back to the cab. I quickly shoved the documents back into Mom's bag and placed it exactly where I found it. I wiped away a stray tear, then closed the iron box door with a heavy thud. As I walked back to the front of the truck, I no longer felt tired. I felt cold. My sadness had sharpened into a quiet, deadly anger. I climbed into the passenger seat and buckled my seatbelt. Hank glanced at me, perhaps noticing the change in my expression, but he didn't ask. He started the engine, and the vibration now felt like war drums in my ears. We began to move again, leaving the lights of the diner behind for the darkness of the long highway. In my mind, I began to form a plan. I would no longer be the compliant Sierra. If Mom and Cassidy viewed me as nothing more than a freight carrier, they would soon realize that these belongings were the only things I could take away from their lives. The morning sun pierced through the truck's windshield, blinding my eyes which had only managed to stay shut for 2 hours. The truck driven by Hank continued to rumble across state lines, emitting a consistent and monotonous engine hum. My head felt heavy, but the anger I discovered inside the cargo box last night worked far more effectively than any amount of caffeine. The image of that plane ticket refund slip still haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, the vision of the new watch on Cassidy's wrist appeared like a mockery. My phone, lying on the dashboard, began to vibrate. The name Mom flashed on the screen. Usually I would pick up immediately with a worried tone, asking if they had arrived or if they needed help with anything. But this time, I let it vibrate until the call disconnected on its own. I didn't want to hear her voice pretending to be sad about our limited funds. The phone vibrated a second time. Hank glanced at my phone, then at me. He didn't say a word, but his expression seemed to ask why I wasn't answering. Finally, on the third call, I swiped the green button. I pressed the phone to my ear without saying a single word. Mom's voice sounded incredibly cheerful on the other end. She raved about the amazing breakfast buffet at the hotel and how beautiful the city view was from their room window. She talked for 2 full minutes about how much Cassidy loved the atmosphere in Seattle, even before they had truly moved in. After she finished boasting about their fun, only then did she ask if I had eaten and how the belongings in the back were doing. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice flat. I replied that I was fine and the items were intact. Mom then began to complain about how expensive the taxi from the airport was and how we really had to save money for the next month. Hearing that, my hands balled into fists in my lap. I desperately wanted to scream and ask about the smartwatch she bought for Cassidy, but I held it in. It wasn't time yet. Mom then asked me to take a note. She wanted me to ensure that box number 42, which contained her crystal collection, was placed at the very top when the truck arrived. She explained in detail how precious that box was and how devastated she would be if even one piece cracked. I only responded with a short grunt. A sense of loathing began to crawl in my chest. In Mom's eyes, I wasn't just an unpaid backup driver, but also a walking insurance policy for her luxury items that we didn't actually need. After hanging up, I threw the phone onto the seat. Hank cleared his throat softly. He asked if everything was okay at home. I turned to him and told him what I had found last night about the canceled ticket and the watch receipt. Hank remained silent for quite a while. He turned the steering wheel casually as we passed through a sharp curve. He then said that in his 30 years as a driver, he had often seen people treated like burdens by their own families. He said that those always considered strong are usually the ones most exploited because they are assumed to never break. Hank's words hit me hard. All this time, I was proud to be called the strong one. I felt it was a compliment, a sign that I was superior to Cassidy. But now I realized it was just a label they used to keep me working without protest. Being strong was Mom's excuse for not giving me attention. Being strong was Cassidy's excuse to remain useless. We stopped at a large gas station in Nebraska to refuel. While Hank was busy with the truck, I walked to a long wooden bench in front of the convenience store. I opened my phone and began re-examining the digital documents I had photographed last night. I looked at the dates once more. Mom had canceled my ticket exactly on my 22nd birthday. She hadn't even given me a gift this year, claiming we were saving for the move. In reality, my gift money was used to pamper Cassidy. I began to see a pattern that had been happening for years. When I graduated high school with top honors, there was no celebration because the money had to be used for Cassidy's summer course, which she never finished. When I wanted to buy a used car with my own hard-earned money, Mom asked me to lend it to her to pay off her credit card debt, which turned out to be mostly Cassidy's clothes shopping. I stood up and stared at my reflection in the store window. I looked haggard in a jacket that was starting to tear at the sleeves. My hair was a mess and my face was pale. I looked like someone who had just lost everything, while the people I protected were enjoying luxury from the fruits of my sacrifice. At that moment, a new resolve was born. I got back into the truck as Hank was ready to leave. I asked him how much longer we needed to reach Seattle. He estimated about 30 more hours if the weather stayed good. 30 hours. That was the time I had to decide what I would do when I set foot in that new apartment. I no longer planned to unpack those boxes with any enthusiasm. I didn't plan to set up the kitchen or make the beds for them. All this time, I had always been the first person to enter a new home to ensure everything was ready for them. This time, everything would be different. I began to list the items that truly belonged to me in that truck. It turned out there weren't many, only 5 small boxes containing books and clothes. The rest of the massive truckload belonged to them. Their luxury, their memories, and their egos. I stared at the vast stretch of asphalt ahead. For the first time, I felt that this highway wasn't just taking us to Seattle, but taking me away from the version of myself that always said yes to Mom's every demand. I would still be the strong one, but this time my strength wouldn't be for propping them up. My strength would be for leaving and building my own life without carrying someone else's burden on my back. The sky over, Wyoming turned dark gray in just 30 minutes. Thick clouds hung low, and the wind began to whistle loudly through the gaps in the truck's window glass. Hank slowed the vehicle down as small white grains started hitting the windshield. The snowstorm had arrived earlier than the radio weather forecast predicted. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew tense. Hank kept his focus locked on the road, which was beginning to be covered by a thin layer of ice, while his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. My phone started vibrating again. This time it wasn't just one call, but a barrage of text messages coming in one after another. It was from Mom. I opened them and found a tone of extreme panic. She didn't ask if I was safe or if our truck could still move in the middle of the storm. Her first message was about her new velvet sofa in the back of the truck. She was afraid the extreme cold or humidity would ruin the fabric. The next message followed, reminding me to ensure extra tarps cover Cassidy's branded clothing boxes. I leaned my head back against the seat, feeling utterly disgusted. Outside, visibility began to drop drastically. Other trucks started pulling over to the shoulder, turning on their emergency lights. Hank cursed softly as our rear wheels slipped slightly. This situation was very dangerous. A fully loaded truck could easily slide and flip if hit by a strong crosswind. Yet, for my mother, who was sitting comfortably in a warm Seattle apartment, her top priority remained inanimate objects. I replied to her message briefly, saying we were stuck in a storm and might have to stop. Not a minute later, my phone rang. I picked up and was immediately greeted by Mom's hysterical voice. She said this delay would ruin the schedule for the handyman who was supposed to install the carpets tomorrow morning. She asked me to urge Hank to keep going. She even suggested we find an alternative route that wasn't hit by the storm, as if she understood the terrain better than a professional driver who had traveled this road for decades. I took a deep breath, trying to control my voice so I wouldn't explode. I explained that our lives were more important than a carpet installation schedule. I told her the road had turned into a slippery mirror of ice. However, Mom's answer truly froze my heart. She said I was always exaggerating and loved to dramatize things. She said, "Sierra, you can always handle anything. Don't be a baby just because of a little snow. Think of your sister. She's so sad because her things haven't arrived yet." I cut the call without saying goodbye. Those words, "don't be a baby," kept ringing in my ears. I, who was risking my life on a big truck in the middle of a storm, was called a baby by someone who flew on a plane and slept in a 4-star hotel. Hank glanced at me, then he decided to steer the truck into a large truck stop that was already packed with other vehicles taking shelter. After the truck stopped safely, Hank invited me down for hot chocolate at the cafeteria, but I refused. I wanted to be alone. I climbed into the back box of the truck to check for any leaks or damage from the jolts earlier. While I was inside, surrounded by piles of their possessions, I felt an eerie silence. I sat on one of my dented boxes. I saw box number 42, which Mom worshipped. That crystal box looked very sturdy and safe. Curiosity led me back to Mom's forgotten tote bag. I opened it again, wondering if there was anything else she was hiding. In the inner pocket, I found a small passbook in my name that I hadn't seen in a long time. Mom said she kept it in a bank vault for my future. When I opened it, my heart seemed to stop beating. The balance inside was nearly zero. There was a string of massive cash withdrawals over the last 6 months. That money was the result of my 3 years of part-time work at a hardware store and the insurance money left by Dad that was supposed to be my college tuition next year. Mom had drained it all. She used my name to fund Cassidy's lifestyle and this luxury move, while letting me believe we had no money even to buy a second plane ticket. I sat weakly on the truck floor, which was vibrating from the wind hitting it from outside. This discovery destroyed the remnants of respect I had for Mom. This was no longer just a matter of favoritism. This was the theft of a future. She didn't just put me in this truck. She had robbed my hard work and used it to pamper her favorite child. I took my phone and photographed every page of that passbook as evidence. I also took photos of the watch receipt and the canceled plane ticket. My anger was no longer hot but cold and clear. I realized that if I reached Seattle and handed over all these goods, I would never be free. I would continue to be a money machine and a servant for them until I had nothing left to give. The storm outside raged even more, as if reflecting the chaos in my chest. I heard Cassidy send a message in the family group chat, complaining that the internet connection in their new apartment was a bit slow. She sent a photo of herself wearing a new cashmere sweater, likely bought with money from my savings. I didn't reply. I just stared at the boxes in front of me with a different gaze. I used to see these things as symbols of home and family. Now I saw them as burdens tying my feet so I couldn't run. I began to think, what would happen if these valuables never reached their hands? Or what if I was the one who decided when and how they could get them back? I stepped out of the truck box and locked it tight. When I returned to the front cabin, Hank was sipping coffee from his thermos. He asked if I was okay. I looked at him and gave a small smile, a smile I hadn't given once during this trip. I told him that I had just gained clarity about the direction of my life. We would stay here overnight until the storm subsided. Hank offered his softer seat so I could sleep more comfortably, but I refused. I wanted to feel every inch of this discomfort. I wanted the pain in my back and the cold in my toes to be an eternal reminder that I would never let myself be in this position again. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of a road that diverged into two. And for the first time, I didn't choose the road that led to Mom's house. The snowstorm slowly subsided as dawn broke over the Wyoming horizon. The world outside the truck's glass appeared pristine white, yet my thoughts grew darker and sharper. Hank started the truck engine, and its vibration woke me from a light sleep filled with nightmares of an empty bank passbook. We began to move slowly over the still slick asphalt. All along the way I remained silent, staring at the expanse of snow while planning every step I had to take. I was no longer the poor, punished Sierra. I was the one in control of all the treasures so adored by Mom and Cassidy. Our truck entered Idaho territory during the afternoon. My phone wouldn't stop chiming. Cassidy sent an additional grocery list she wanted as soon as I arrived. She wanted me to unpack her summer clothing boxes first because she wanted to go to a welcoming party in their new apartment neighborhood. Mom also sent a voice message, her voice sounding very sweet, the kind of tone she only used when she wanted something from me. She asked me to give a large tip to the movers later, but she added that I should use my personal money first because her funds were being held up at the bank. I smiled cynically reading that message. My personal money? Which money? The money she had drained for Cassidy's smartwatch and plane ticket? I didn't reply to a single one of their messages. Instead, I started getting busy with my own phone to do much more important research. I looked up legal procedures for property ownership and the cost of renting a self-storage unit on the outskirts of Seattle. All this time, Mom had always used my name for all administrative matters because my credit score was much better than hers, which had been ruined by debt. I just realized that the shipping contract for this moving truck was also in my name. Hank had given the cargo manifest document to me last night to be signed as the owner's representative. In the eyes of the law and this logistics company, I was the legal owner of the entire load in the back of this truck until the goods were unloaded at the final destination. A plan began to form in my head with absolute clarity. I glanced at Hank, who was humming along to a song on the radio. I asked him casually if it was possible to change the drop-off location at the last minute. Hank explained that as long as the person whose name was on the contract requested it, it could be done, though there would be an additional administrative fee. He said he only followed orders from whoever paid his bills. I counted the remaining cash I had hidden in my shoe, the only place Mom didn't know about. The amount was enough to rent a medium-sized storage unit for 2 months. I wouldn't let those things get lost, but I wouldn't let them enjoy them easily either. If Mom thought I functioned only as a freight carrier, then she would soon feel what it was like to lose that service. At 5 in the evening, we crossed the Washington border. Green pine forest scenery began to replace the expanse of snow. Mom called again, this time sounding impatient. She asked for our exact position because she had booked the movers for 8 tomorrow morning. I answered in the calmest voice possible, saying we might be a bit late due to an engine check at the border. Mom grumbled, complaining about how hard it was to manage everything without me by her side. She didn't even realize that it was both a compliment and admission that she was actually helpless without me. I turned off my phone and removed my SIM card. For the first time in 10 years, I felt free from their endless demands. I asked Hank to stop at one last rest area before entering downtown Seattle. There, I used a public payphone to contact the storage manager I had marked. I booked a unit with a secret access code. Back in the cabin, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift slightly. I stared out the window, seeing road signs showing that Seattle was only a few dozen miles away. I imagined Cassidy's face when she realized that the suitcase containing her expensive clothes wouldn't arrive at the apartment tomorrow morning. I imagined Mom's face when she saw her apartment living room empty, without her velvet sofa or her favorite box number 42 crystals. Hank asked if I had given the new apartment address to his logistics headquarters. I shook my head and handed him a slip of paper containing the address of the storage unit I had just booked. Hank looked confused for a moment, but then he saw my eyes. He was a man who had seen plenty of life's dramas on the road. He didn't ask many questions. He just nodded, changed the coordinates on his satellite navigation device, and steered the giant truck away from the city center toward the industrial area on the outskirts. In the darkness of the truck box, the items rattled with the movement of the truck. All the luxuries bought with the money stolen from my savings were now heading to a place where they wouldn't be able to touch them. This wasn't about an explosive anger. This was about a total withdrawal. I would give them what they had been giving me all this time, nothingness. As the lights of Seattle began to appear in the distance, I felt like a soldier who had just won a battle without having to fire a single shot. I had spent my whole life being the strong one to prop up their happiness. Now, I would use that strength to prop up myself. Tonight, they would sleep in an empty apartment on a cold floor, exactly the way they treated me during this journey. And that was only the beginning of everything. The truck came to a stop with a long hiss of air brakes in front of a concrete building complex, surrounded by a barbed wire fence. This was not the luxury downtown Seattle apartment my mother expected. Instead, it was a self-storage facility in a desolate industrial area. Hank cut the engine, making the night silence feel incredibly eerie. I stared out the window, looking at the rows of orange steel doors lined up neatly under the flickering glow of the streetlights. I climbed out of the cab and handled the paperwork at the gate office, which was open 24 hours. Using my ID and the shipping contract, which was indeed in my name, the process went very quickly. I paid the rent for the next 2 months using the last of my remaining cash. The facility guard gave me a large padlock key and a digital access code. I walked back toward the truck and signaled Hank to back the vehicle right in front of unit number 118. The unloading process began. Hank helped me move the items because he felt sorry seeing me do it alone. We worked in silence, with only the sound of cardboard sliding across the concrete floor. One by one, their luxuries changed locations. The velvet sofa my mother worries so much about, Cassidy's expensive vanity table, and even box number 42 containing the precious crystals, all were now piled inside the cold, dark concrete room. I made sure my own small boxes remained at the very front so I could retrieve them easily later. When we were almost finished, I reinserted the SIM card into my phone. Within seconds, the device vibrated nonstop. There were 32 missed calls and nearly 50 text messages. I opened the most recent one. My mother sounded furious. She said the movers had been waiting in front of the apartment for an hour and were charging a high waiting fee. She demanded to know where I was and why my phone was off. A few minutes later, a message from Cassidy arrived. She was swearing, saying she couldn't take a shower because her towels and soap were in the truck. She also complained about having to sleep on a hard floor with only her jacket as a mat. Reading that, I didn't feel the slightest bit of pity. Instead, I remembered how I had slept in a hard truck seat for the last 2 nights without them caring at all. I decided to reply to my mother's message. I sent a photo of the storage unit door, which was now securely padlocked. Below the photo, I wrote a short message I had been composing in my head since crossing the Idaho border. I told her that all the belongings had arrived in Seattle, but would not be delivered to their apartment. I informed her that I knew about the cancellation of my plane ticket, about Cassidy's smartwatch, and most importantly, about the savings she had drained completely. I explained that the items would remain in this storage unit until she returned all of my father's insurance money that she had taken. I provided very accurate figures, including the interest I should have earned. I also emphasized that the storage contract and the shipping contract were in my name, so legally, they could not force the facility guard to open the unit without my presence. My phone rang immediately. It was a call from my mother. I answered it but didn't put it to my ear. I turned on the speaker so Hank could hear it too. My mother's voice exploded on the other end. She screamed that I was an ungrateful daughter, that I had no right to hold the family's belongings hostage, and she threatened to report me to the police. She cried, saying she had raised me with great difficulty, and this was how I repaid her. I waited until she was out of breath before I finally spoke. My voice was very calm, almost cold. I told her that if she called the police, I would be the one with the stronger evidence. I had proof of money theft from my bank account and proof of identity fraud. I also reminded her that the police would be very interested to see the receipt for a luxury watch purchase made while she claimed to have no money for her daughter's plane ticket. Hearing that, my mother went silent instantly. In the background, I could hear Cassidy winging, asking when her clothes would arrive. I told my mother that starting tonight, I was no longer part of the team she was so proud of whenever she needed help. I had given my entire youth to serve them, and now I was taking back what was rightfully mine. I hung up the phone before she could hurl any more insults. Hank looked at me with a gaze of admiration mixed with a bit of awe. He shook my hand and said that he had traveled thousands of miles, but this was the first time he had seen someone stand tall against the storm within their own family. He offered to drop me off at the nearest bus terminal before he headed back to his headquarters. I accepted his offer with gratitude. As I sat on the bus heading toward the city center, I looked out the window. The bright lights of Seattle looked incredibly beautiful. For the first time in my life, I had no definite plan for where I would sleep tomorrow or what I would eat. However, for the first time, I also felt incredibly light. I was no longer carrying the burden of two adults who had been draining my energy for years. I pulled a small box of clothes and my books from the shopping bag I carried. Inside one of my father's old books, I found a small photo of the two of us when I was 5 years old. My father once told me that the only person I could fully rely on in this world was myself. For a long time, I thought that was a message about loneliness, but now I realized it was a message about power. I turned off my phone again, this time for a long while. I would find a cheap motel tonight and start looking for a job in the morning. The belongings in the storage unit would stay there as collateral for the future they stole from me. If my mother and Cassidy wanted to start a new life in Seattle, they would have to do it from zero, just like they forced me to do when they told me to climb onto that moving truck. My physical journey might be over, but my struggle to be truly free had only just begun. My first morning in Seattle welcomed me with a thin drizzle that dampened the windows of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I woke up not to the sound of Cassidy's shouting as she searched for a missing sock, but to an unfamiliar silence. My body still felt stiff after days of being in the truck, yet my mind was much clearer than before. I turned on my phone just to check the situation, and instantly, dozens of notifications flooded in like a tidal wave. It turned out Mom and Cassidy hadn't given up so easily. It seemed they had spent the night awake in their cold, empty apartment. There was a string of messages from Cassidy with shifting tones, ranging from harsh insults to pleas that sounded incredibly fake. She sent a message saying she was freezing and couldn't sleep because she only had the concrete floor to lie on. She even sent a selfie of herself crying, hoping I would cave as usual. But looking at that photo, I only remembered the bill for her smartwatch, which cost more than the price of my comfort during the journey. Mom took a different route. She tried to contact me through social media and even sent an incredibly long email. It was a list of every sacrifice she had made for me over the last 22 years. She brought up my school fees from when I was a child, and how hard she worked as a single parent. It was a classic emotional manipulation tactic. For years, this tactic had always succeeded in making me feel guilty and eventually doing whatever she asked. But this time, the data from my emptied bank books served as a powerful shield for my heart. I decided not to reply to their private messages. Instead, I contacted the management office of the apartment where they were staying. I wanted to confirm one thing. Was my name on the lease? My suspicion was correct. Due to Mom's poor credit history, she had listed my name as the primary guarantor or co-signer. It was an incredibly reckless move on her part. I immediately asked the management to remove my name from the contract or provide a statement that I was not responsible for future payments since I was not living there. Around 10 in the morning, I received a call from an unknown number. It was the voice of a man who identified himself as a security officer from the storage complex I had visited last night. He informed me that two women were trying to force their way into Unit 118. They claimed to be the owners of the goods and were screaming at the gate. I asked the officer to remain firm. I explained that I was the legally registered tenant and if they continued to cause a scene, the security team had every right to call the police to have them removed. Hearing that they had actually gone to the warehouse made me smile slightly. They weren't looking for me because they missed me or felt guilty. They were looking for me because they needed a bed, their fancy clothes, and that crystal collection. They were looking for me because I was the key to the comfortable lifestyle they were accustomed to. Without me, they were just two people stranded in a big city without any supplies. I spent the rest of the morning at a public library looking for job openings. I needed an income as soon as possible so I wouldn't keep staying at a motel that was draining my remaining cash. I applied to several furniture stores and logistics companies. My 3 years of experience at a hardware store and my journey guarding a truck across state lines turned out to be a great asset. By midday, I had already secured an interview for the following day. While I was having lunch at a small diner, my phone vibrated again. This time, a short message from Mom came in with a much lower tone. She said they were starving because they couldn't find any cooking utensils or the credit card I usually held for household affairs. She apologized, though I knew the apology was merely a tool to regain access to the warehouse. She invited me to meet at a city park to discuss everything as a family. I hesitated for a moment, but I realized that a direct confrontation was necessary to set clear boundaries. I agreed to the meeting, but I chose a very crowded and open location. I arrived at the park 15 minutes early. I sat on a wooden bench watching people pass by with their pets. Life felt so normal for everyone else, while mine had just experienced a massive explosion. Mom and Cassidy appeared from a distance. They looked in stark contrast to their surroundings. Cassidy was wearing an expensive jacket that looked crumpled, and her face was without makeup, a very rare occurrence. Mom looked exhausted, her eyes red. As they sat in front of me, there were no warm hugs. There was only a tension that could be felt by anyone passing by. Mom began to speak with a trembling voice. She tried to explain that the money in my savings was borrowed for emergency moving costs and she planned to replace it as soon as she got a new job in Seattle. However, when I asked her to show proof of her repayment plan, she began to stutter. Cassidy was bolder. She accused me of being a coward for hiding their things when they were in desperate need. I let them speak until they were finished. Once they were silent, I pulled out the copies of the documents I had photographed from Mom's bag. I placed them on the park table. I showed the cancellation slip for my plane ticket, which coincided with the purchase of Cassidy's watch. I also showed the systematic history of withdrawals from Dad's insurance money over 6 months. You weren't borrowing my money, I said in a calm but firm voice. You were erasing my future for your momentary comfort. And that trip in the truck? That was Mom's way of throwing me in the trash while hoping I'd still perform my duties as a servant. Mom tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled it back. I told them the condition for opening the warehouse was simple. Mom had to sign a legal debt acknowledgement letter and provide collateral in the form of the heirloom jewelry from Grandma she had been keeping. Additionally, I wanted my name cleared from all of their financial affairs in Seattle. If not, the goods would stay there until the rent ran out and the storage facility held an open auction. Cassidy screamed that I was cruel, but I just looked at her blankly. I stood up and left them sitting on the park bench. I didn't look back even as I heard Mom calling my name repeatedly. The guilt that usually haunted me had completely vanished, replaced by a sense of pride because I finally dared to stand up for myself. That night, I returned to the motel feeling victorious. I knew this battle wasn't truly over, but my bargaining position was now much stronger. I was no longer the Sierra they could toss into a moving truck. I was the one holding the keys to their future. The next morning brought a different kind of energy. I woke up before the alarm went off, put on the best shirt I had managed to save from my backpack, and combed my hair neatly. Today was the schedule for my first interview at a large logistics distribution company on the outskirts of the city. I didn't have time to dwell on the drama at the park yesterday. My main focus was to earn an income so that I would never have to return to the empty apartment occupied by Mom and Cassidy. The interview went more smoothly than I had imagined. The company's operations manager, a middle-aged woman who appeared very efficient, was impressed by my resilience in traveling cross-country in the cabin of a cargo truck. She said that people who could endure such situations usually possess a strong mentality and high discipline. That same afternoon, I was accepted as a junior inventory coordinator with a salary sufficient to rent a small room in a worker's dormitory. I felt like I had just won the lottery, even though it was the result of my own hard work. However, that peace did not last long. Just as I stepped out of the company office, my phone rang. This time it wasn't a call from Mom, but from the storage warehouse management. The same officer from yesterday informed me that a man claiming to be the Vance family lawyer had arrived with Mom. A man brought several documents and demanded that access to the warehouse be opened immediately because the items inside were claimed as the legal property of Cynthia Vance. I immediately ordered a taxi and headed to the warehouse location. When I arrived, I saw Mom standing next to a sharply dressed man holding a leather briefcase. Nearby, Cassidy leaned against the wall with a triumphant expression as if she had just summoned a massive army to destroy me. As soon as I got out of the taxi, the man approached me and introduced himself as the legal representative hired by Mom. He began to speak in a patronizing tone, explaining that withholding someone else's property could be categorized as theft or embezzlement. He showed documents stating that most of the furniture and valuables in the warehouse were purchased using a credit card in my mother's name. He urged me to hand over the padlock keys right now if I didn't want this matter to end up in court. I took a deep breath, trying not to be intimidated by the legal jargon he used. I pulled out the shipping contract documents from my bag along with the warehouse lease agreement. I explained to the lawyer that legally, this logistics and storage contract was in my own name. I also showed proof that the truck shipping costs from Ohio to Seattle had not been fully paid, and I was the one responsible for those bills. If Mom wants to take these items, I said, looking the man straight in the eyes, please pay the remaining logistics bill of $2,000, reimburse the rent for this warehouse, and most importantly, show proof that the money used to buy these items did not come from my personal savings account, which was drained without permission. Hearing the words, savings account drained without permission, the lawyer fell silent for a moment. He glanced at Mom, who suddenly turned her face away. I then produced copies of bank statements showing the flow of funds from my savings to Mom's credit card just before those luxury items were purchased. I explained that if this case went to court, I would countersue for identity fraud and theft of insurance funds belonging to a minor who had just transitioned to adult status. The atmosphere in front of the warehouse door suddenly shifted. The lawyer cleared his throat, then whispered softly to Mom. It seemed he had just realized his client hadn't told him the whole truth. Mom began to look panicked. She approached me and tried to whisper, asking me not to embarrass her in front of a stranger. However, I no longer cared about her shame. She didn't think about my shame when I had to hitch a ride on a moving truck like extra cargo. Cassidy, who was losing patience, finally exploded. She screamed that she needed her clothes for the art school opening event next week. She insulted me, calling me selfish. However, her words only made me chuckle. I asked her, Who is actually the selfish one? Someone trying to protect her property, or someone living luxuriously off the money from her own siblings' hard work? The lawyer finally withdrew. He told Mom that he needed to review the case and suggested that the matter be resolved as a family before involving the law further. He left the three of us in front of the warehouse unit, which remained tightly locked. Their hope of scaring me with legal threats had failed miserably. Mom sat down on a waiting bench provided by the warehouse. She began to cry, but this time her tears sounded like those of someone who had lost, not someone who felt regret. She confessed that she did all of it because she was afraid Cassidy wouldn't be able to compete in Seattle if she didn't look her best. She assumed I was already independent and therefore no longer needed that savings money. That warped logic made me realize that for Mom, my existence was merely a safety net for her favorite child. I told them that I would not let them into the warehouse today. However, I gave a little leeway. I would provide 2 boxes of Cassidy's clothes if Mom signed a legal debt acknowledgement letter in front of a notary tomorrow morning. The rest would remain under my supervision until I saw goodwill from them to return what was rightfully mine. That night, when I returned to my small and simple new dormitory room, I felt very proud. I only had one small bed and a desk, but this place was 100% mine. There were no stolen goods here, no shadows of manipulation. Mom and Cassidy might have an apartment with a city view, but they lacked dignity or peace. I realized that this journey had changed me into someone who could no longer be oppressed. I had a job, I had evidence of their crimes, and most importantly, I held the key to all their remaining wealth. My new life at the workers' dormitory began with a very disciplined routine. Every morning, I woke up at 5 to head to the logistics warehouse where I worked. The job was physically demanding, yet it provided an incredible sense of mental satisfaction. For the first time in my life, every cent I earned went straight into my own pocket, without Mom's hands or Cassidy's sudden needs draining it. I began learning to save again, this time with a new bank account that could only be accessed via my fingerprint. Meanwhile, Mom and Cassidy's lives in their luxury apartment began to show signs of cracking. Without my presence to manage everything from paying the electric bills to ensuring the fridge was stocked, they seemed like people who had lost their way. Cassidy, who had never done her own laundry or even boiled water in her life, began to feel the harsh sting of reality. Through her social media posts, I could see a drastic change. Gone were the aesthetic photos with branded clothing. In their place were complaints about washing machines she didn't know how to use or anger over food delivery services being too expensive. The climax occurred on Thursday of my second week at work. Cassidy sent a barrage of text messages that were deeply concerning. She said her art school required massive fees for equipment, and Mom had no cash at all because all her credit card limits were maxed out. She begged me to sell 1 or 2 pieces of furniture from the storage warehouse to help cover the costs. She even promised to wash the dishes for an entire month if I agreed to help. I simply read the message while sipping coffee in the office break room, amazed that they still viewed me as an emergency fund. I decided not to reply to Cassidy's message. Instead, I contacted Mom directly. I told her that I had arranged a meeting with a notary to sign a formal debt acknowledgement letter. I set an absolute condition. If the letter wasn't signed this week, I would begin auctioning off the items in the warehouse to cover my losses. Mom had no choice. She arrived at the notary's office on Friday afternoon looking 10 years older. She signed the document without saying much, a legal admission that she owed me thousands of dollars. In exchange, I provided a spare key to the warehouse so they could retrieve a few boxes of Cassidy's clothes and basic cooking utensils. However, I kept the master key and did not allow them to take the large furniture or the crystal collection until the first payment was made. During the retrieval process, I caught Cassidy trying to rummage through my boxes to look for money or other valuables. I immediately reprimanded her sternly. She looked at me with deep hatred, claiming that I had turned into a cruel stranger. I simply replied that I hadn't changed. I had just stopped being their servant. A few days later, I received information from an acquaintance in Ohio that Mom had tried to borrow money from our aunt, using the excuse that I was terminally ill. Fortunately, I had already sent a brief message to the entire extended family explaining the truth about the plane tickets and my savings. Aunt Sarah refused to provide the loan and instead scolded Mom for lying. Mom's old tactic of manipulating others by using my name no longer worked. Their world was shrinking, and they were finally being forced to stand on their own 2 feet. At work, my performance earned praise from the operations manager. Because of my meticulousness in managing inventory, I was offered a permanent position with full health benefits. This was a level of security I had never felt before. I began to feel that Seattle could truly become home for me, not as a place of escape, but as the place where I built a new identity as an independent Sierra. I even began attending night classes at a local university to pursue the logistics management degree that had been put on hold. The following week, Cassidy called me crying hysterically. She had been kicked out of a major project at her art school because she couldn't afford high-quality materials. She blamed me for her failure, saying I had destroyed her dreams. I listened to her crying calmly, then asked her one thing. Had she ever considered how I felt when Mom destroyed my dream of going to college right on my 22nd birthday? Cassidy went silent. She had no answer. She had never been taught to think of anyone but herself. I hung up the phone with a strange sense of relief. I realized that helping Cassidy the wrong way all this time had actually made her mentally and socially handicapped. By letting her face hardship now, I was actually giving her one last chance to grow up, even if she hated me for it. I turned my focus back to the stack of documents on my desk. I had a future to organize, and it no longer involved being responsible for someone else's failures. That night, I walked along the edge of the Seattle harbor, watching the lights of the ships moving slowly across the water. For the first time since leaving Ohio in that truck cabin, I felt truly at peace. I had proven that being the strong one didn't mean having to carry everyone's burden. True strength is the ability to say no and walk away when your dignity is being trampled. I know Mom and Cassidy may never change, but that is no longer my problem. I have set down their weight at that storage warehouse, and I have no intention of picking it up again. The second month in Seattle brought shocking news. I was sitting in the office cafeteria when I received an official email from the management of the apartment where Mom and Cassidy lived. Because I had withdrawn my name as a guarantor, and Mom had failed to pay the second month's rent on time, they were issued a 14-day eviction notice. Mom was caught between her pride and a cruel economic reality. She did not have a steady job, and Cassidy had just lost her partial scholarship because her grades had plummeted. 2 days later, Mom asked to meet me at a small cafe not far from my dormitory. Her appearance was distressing. The dark circles under her eyes were prominent, and her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup. Without preamble, she told me she had made a desperate decision. She would cancel the lease on the luxury apartment and move into a much smaller studio unit in a less secure suburb. The recovered deposit money would be used to pay the first installment of her debt to me. I stared at her with mixed emotions. A part of me felt pity, but another part reminded me of the 1,000-mile journey in that hard truck seat. Mom explained that she finally realized the lifestyle she had forced for Cassidy was an illusion that was destroying our family. She admitted to selling Cassidy's smartwatch at a pawn shop to buy groceries the previous week. It was the first time I had seen Mom act logically and responsibly without me having to ask. That decision sparked a major war between Mom and Cassidy. Cassidy refused to move to the small apartment. She felt humiliated in front of her new friends at art school. Through angry text messages, Cassidy accused me of brainwashing Mom into being cruel to her. She even threatened to leave home and live with a friend she had just met. I only replied to her message with one sentence. Enjoy learning how to be an adult, Cassidy. Seeing Mom starting to make an effort, I decided to show a little leniency. I agreed to open the storage warehouse and help them move the necessary items to their cramped new apartment. However, I insisted that I would not lift a single box. I hired professional movers using the money Mom paid me as a debt installment. I wanted Mom and Cassidy to witness the process, to see their belongings moving from one place to another as a consequence of their own actions. Move-in day felt incredibly emotional. When the door to warehouse unit 118 was opened, the scent of dust and old memories wafted out. Cassidy looked devastated seeing how many items would not fit into her new apartment. The velvet sofa she was so proud of had to be sold because it was too large for their cramped studio. Her luxury vanity table was also forced to be left behind. Watching those luxury goods being hauled away by second-hand buyers, Cassidy sobbed uncontrollably. This time, her tears were not for manipulation, but tears for the loss of the false identity she had worshipped for so long. Mom stood beside me as the buyer's truck drove away. She apologized again, this time with a more sincere voice. She admitted that all this time she had viewed me as her life insurance, someone who would always be there to clean up the messes she made. She said that my courage to leave and withhold those items was the slap she needed to wake up. Although I have not fully forgiven her, I appreciated her admission. I told her that our relationship might never be the same, but I didn't hate her. I simply didn't want to be a victim of her decisions anymore. That evening, after all the remaining items were moved to their small apartment, I returned to the now empty storage warehouse. I only have 5 boxes of my own left. I called Hank, the truck driver who brought me to Seattle, just to let him know I was okay. Hank laughed over the phone and said he always knew I would find a way. He encouraged me to keep moving forward and never look back with regret. I took my 5 boxes to the dormitory by taxi. As I arranged my college books on the small desk in my room, I felt the cycle had finally closed. I had recovered my money gradually, I had a stable job, and I had forced my family to face reality. The emotional burden I had carried since Ohio had fully dissolved. I was no longer Sierra, the overlooked strong child, but Sierra, the wise survivor. That night, Seattle was drenched in heavy rain. I sat by the window, watching the city lights reflecting on the wet asphalt. I thought of Mom and Cassidy, perhaps huddled together in their studio apartment, trying to figure out how to live with limitations. I hope they truly learn. More importantly, I know that tomorrow morning I will wake up feeling free. No more secrets, no more useless sacrifices, and no more painful truck journeys. I am ready to write the final chapter of this journey on my own terms. 1 year has passed since the night I stood alone in front of that cold storage warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle. This city no longer feels foreign or intimidating. Now, every rain-soaked street corner feels like a part of my personal victory. I no longer live in a worker's dormitory. Thanks to a promotion to logistics supervisor and my discipline in saving, I managed to rent a comfortable little studio apartment near the city center. The place is not luxurious, but every inch of it was paid for with my own sweat and honesty. This morning, I'm sitting in a modern cafe with a harbor view, waiting for someone I haven't met face to face in a long time. I am wearing professional work attire and holding a folder containing debt closure documents. Mom and Cassidy finally agreed to meet after months of us communicating only through formal text messages. I want to settle all these past affairs so I can step into the future without any remaining burdens. Mom arrives first. Her appearance is much better compared to when they were evicted from their apartment last year. She now works as an administrative staff member at a local hospital. Her job is stable, even though the salary is not large. She has learned to live within her means. Not long after, Cassidy appears. She looks very different. Her hair is no longer dyed in flashy colors, and she wears a server's uniform from a well-known bakery. She is no longer attending that expensive art school. Instead, she is taking a short online graphic design course while working part-time. The atmosphere at our table is initially stiff. Cassidy seems ashamed to look me in the eye. However, I begin the conversation in a very calm tone. I take the documents out of the folder and place them on the table. I tell Mom that the installments she paid over the last 12 months have been enough to cover most of my lost savings. As for the remaining debt, I have decided to forgive it. I am not doing this because I am weak, but because I no longer want a reason to stay angry or tied to this conflict. Mom sheds a few tears, but this time I see sincerity in her eyes. She admits that losing access to the items in the warehouse a year ago was the best thing that ever happened to her. It forced her to stop dreaming at the expense of someone else's suffering. She tells me how difficult the first 6 months were without my help, but that difficulty is what finally made her feel like a useful human being again. She no longer asks me to fix her problems. She only asks if I would like to visit for dinner occasionally. Cassidy then speaks up in a soft voice. She apologizes for all her selfish behavior over the years. She admits that working at the bakery for 10 hours a day made her realize how hard it is to earn the money she used to waste so carelessly. She even shares that she sold the smartwatch, the one that originally triggered my anger, to pay for her own course fees. Seeing her change, I feel a glimmer of hope. She is no longer the spoiled princess, but a young woman beginning to understand the meaning of responsibility. I look at the two of them and realize one important thing. If I had remained the strong one who always gave in back in Ohio, the three of us might have ended up destroyed in Seattle. My decision to fight back, hold their belongings hostage, and distance myself was the harshest yet most effective act of love. I saved myself, and indirectly, I gave them the chance to save themselves too. After the meeting ends, I walk them to the front of the cafe. We do not hug dramatically like in the movies, but there is a firm handshake and an honest smile. I tell them that I need time to truly return to the family dynamic, and they respect that boundary. I stand on the sidewalk, watching the two of them walk toward the bus stop. They look like a normal family trying their best, and that is more than enough for me. I walk toward my own car, a used vehicle I bought with the fruits of my own labor. Before getting in, I remember Hank's gray truck. I recall the coldness of that cabin and the smell of stale coffee that accompanied me across the continent. That journey was the lowest point of my life, but it also became the strongest foundation I ever had. Without the experience of being tossed into that moving truck, I might never have known how much strength I kept inside me. Now, the name Sierra Vance is no longer just a name on a contract or a drained bank book. My name is a symbol of someone who dared to determine her own fate. I start the car engine and begin driving toward my office. On the radio, the song Hank used to play often comes on again. I hum along softly while enjoying the view of the city moving forward. My life in Seattle has truly just begun. There are no more boxes of the past blocking my way. No more tickets canceled unilaterally. I hold full control over the wheel of my own life. As I cross the large bridge overlooking the bay, I take a deep breath and smile. This journey was indeed long and painful, but the view at this finish line is much more beautiful than I ever imagined. I have finally arrived home, and that home is myself.